Hello, I'm Heslop-Harrison and I'm going to be telling you about some of our research at the University of Leicester and Chinese Academy of Sciences on biodiversity and agriculture and the way that we're meeting some of the global challenges in our projects. This is part of the BS 2059 Global Change Biology course. So the key question which we are asking is, how do we feed, clothe and warm 8 billion people without trashing the planet? Something that many people would say that we are doing. Well, of course, we're doing this through agriculture, through farming, and about half of the world's population is urban and buys their food, clothing, and heating product from supermarkets and markets around the world. And it's an interesting exercise to see just how much of the world's biodiversity is actually represented in the products which we can buy in a supermarket. So next time you are in a supermarket, just have a look around and think how many different products are there and how many different species those represent. Altogether in the world, there are about 350,000 flowering plants, angiosperms, many more algae and insect species which aren't grown very much in agriculture. And then there are about 6,500 mammals and 10,000 birds. But we only use a very small proportion of this total in the foods and feeds that we eat. For the plants in the supermarket, you will find there are only about 30 major crops that represent the very high proportion of all which we eat. And there are about 200 other species which are present. Many of those are minor and spices. We only eat sheep, cows, and pigs as the major mammals, although there are many minor ones, including things like goats and deer, venison, and so forth. And then birds, chicken by far the major bird that we eat, although duck is quite widely available. So it's just a small proportion of this biodiversity we're using. But as I'll be talking about, in fact, particularly in the plants, much wider sources of biodiversity are used in breeding the crops that we eat, and there's a lot of potential for additional species. So that's a number of species. Where are they grown? Well, here is an interesting map which is colored by how the world's land is used. The colors represent different uses, and you can see that the built-up area represents about 1% of the total, and permanent permafrost represents about 10% in permanent snow and ice. Barren land in deserts, salty areas, tops of mountains and so forth is about 19% of the total. But about a quarter of the total land is used for livestock production, particularly through grazing, but some through feed crops, and about 7% for crops that we eat directly. So a fair proportion of the usable land is already cropped and used for food production for the people. And of course, the whole of the land surface and the water, for that matter, is impacted by the people and heavily managed to produce what we actually need. And those are the 6 F's of farming: food and feed being very important, fuel, whether that's as biomass, wood, or as biofuels that are processed, distilled, or otherwise processed from oils. Then there are the fibers, the cotton and the wool, which we wear, also from farms. And then I put down flowers and fun, whether that's horticultural products or turf grasses, amenity grasses, and so forth. And the last F, the pharmaceuticals, the natural products that produce many of the basic ingredients in the drugs that we have. So what then are the objectives of farming? Well, we aim to take the inputs in the terms of light, heat, water, grasses and nutrients into an ecosystem, which can be represented as a cycling circle in the middle here, and then extract from that crops, i.e. fixed energy. Extract those and take as many of those out as we can without collapsing the whole of the circle. So pulling out the crops in the terms of chemical energy while keeping the circle continuing to turn. But it's not only the crops that we're taking out of that circle, but there's also what can be called ecosystem services, which are modified versions of the input, and these can be very important for our life and what we're doing. So if we put impure water into an ecosystem, we can get out pure drinking water after it's been processed by that. Of course, we get the fixation of the carbon dioxide that we're all hearing about from the COP deliberations this week. The crops are removing the carbon dioxide, fixing it into carbon, and they're also releasing oxygen from and recycling the oxygen. Nutrients, they prevent runoff of the nutrients, and of course the heat is another one that we don't always think about, because where a cropland is present, it will often buffer the sunlight, keep it warm at night, and stop it getting too hot in the daytime. So there's many ecosystem services which we also need to ensure are maintained. So we need to feed the people, but without destroying the planet. So one important aspect that we need to think about is that actually life is already at the edge of stability. And if we weren't at that edge of stability, then enzymes in our bodies wouldn't be able to oxidize and gain energy from what we eat. So life is occurring at the verge of the stability, and the 20% oxygen that we have now lets us use the energy properly. If there were more oxygen, then forest fires would become incredibly devastating and soon burn until they reduced the oxygen down to 20%. If we went below the 20% oxygen, then life would be very different, because oxidation of the fixed carbon wouldn't happen. I've already mentioned that water quality and quantity are very important and very limiting to what we do in ecosystems. So what things can go wrong? Well, one key aspect of that is erosion. And here we can see a picture in Africa of an overgrazed area that would actually, with good management, there would be much more vegetation here, but as it is, the goats are herded and remove all of the vegetation, and the management here is a major problem. But of course, management isn't just a problem today. Here's an example of what happened in medieval times. This is in Ireland, in the Burren area. Some of you may have visited. It's now a very much preserved landscape, which has some very interesting properties. But actually, this is 1,000 years of overgrazing that we're seeing here, and the native state of this would have 2 or 3 meters of peat on top of that bedrock that's been eroded down. So it's nothing new that we've been devastating the planet. Other ways that we can see that go wrong are where there isn't good vegetation cover, and then we get the dust storms, and here we can see one again in Africa, which is blowing away all of the topsoil, all of the nutrients there, and again eroding back down to bedrock unless something is done better to preserve this. Another problem with degradation of land is through salinity. This is probably a natural occurrence here, but you can see the cakes of salt building up here in a saturated salt solution in this salt lake. And these areas are somewhere where nothing will grow, and you can see the barren areas there. And some areas are certainly becoming more saline from either misuse of irrigation water or overuse of the water that's there. I know that in this course you've also discussed invasive alien species. Here are a couple of examples here. This is a species introduced into Africa from Mexico and Agamemnon, and you can see this vicious thistle is completely goat proof and is taking over a lot of areas in Africa where everything else is eaten by the goats. Equally, here we can see a South American species, Iconia water hyacinth, which occupies a niche which isn't normally used, isn't used by the native plants in India or Africa, and it covers a water surface, and then by removing all the sunlight and the oxygenation of the water, it reduces the quality of that water and reduces the quality, how the water is processed by the native plants, animals, microbes that are there. So things can go wrong, and the circle that I drew can collapse, and it's very important that we manage the land to avoid that. But we also don't want people to live in the sort of poverty which occurs in much of the world. And that's a very important aspect of what one tries to do to improve agriculture. And that's both with the type of food that people have available, its quality, its safety, as well as its quantity, and also the way it's grown. Many of us have ancestors, great-grandfathers, who were either miners or, if not, agricultural labourers, and I think we're all very happy that we're not. And you can see the little girl in the middle picture at the top who's watching her mother in the tedious job outdoors for 8 hours a day, weeding, controlling the weeds to maximize the yields of the crop. And she certainly doesn't want to be able to do that, to be doing that when she grows up, any more than we would like to go back to the other areas, other parts, go back to agriculture, being agricultural labourers. Of course, there are non-solutions to these problems that might be suggested. There isn't much more useful land which we have available. There isn't much more fresh water which is available to us, and very few people actually want to eat less, and we are unlikely to be going down to smaller numbers of people who could preserve the planet the way that it is. But there are ways that I'm going to talk about now about how we can improve that. And this is, for example, one of the answers to the type of erosion that we saw, and that's a control by terracing, so that water moves slowly down through terraces, and many of the areas which previously were suffering from erosion have been improved by these technological solutions to agriculture. We see in this graph exactly how agriculture has provided food for people over the last 60 years or so. You can see at the bottom purple line shows negligible change in the area that's grown. And in that period, the human population has increased 2.5 times or so to the current 8 billion. But the three major crops that represent the majority of all of the starches that are eaten, wheat, rice and maize, you can see those have all increased considerably in their production over that period. So actually there are more calories, more food to go around than there were 60 years ago. What are the phases that's happened to improve this? Well, agronomy was the first phase through the 1960s and 1970s, improving the way that crops were grown. And things like that were, for example, instead of broadcasting seed, instead of throwing seed onto the land and ploughing it and hoping that it will germinate, the introduction of drills and now precision seeders place each seed at an exact point in a field at exactly the right depth that's optimized for its growth, have had a major impact on the production. Other aspects, of course, are the use of fertilizers, artificial fertilizers, and about half of the nitrogen in our bodies comes from artificial fixed nitrogen made from mostly using methane gas and nitrogen in the air. And this has been revolutionized the amount of food that can be produced from the limited land that we have available. Better use of water has also improved the agronomy, and of course crop protection chemicals that control the insects that eat a high proportion of crops, and the diseases which also destroy them, fungus, bacteria, and viral diseases that the plants suffer from just as much as people. So the next phase then is the genetic phase, and through the 80s and 90s into the 2000s, the genetics has represented more than half of the improvement in the yield. So crops which have a higher proportion of the biomass is available to be harvested, higher yield, higher production of biomass, and better resistance to pests, diseases, and biotic stresses from water, temperature, abiotic stresses from water, temperature, and so forth. And here we can see some figures showing that in the biggest period here, the genotype, genetic component, has been considerably more important than the environmental component, the way a plant is grown in the recent phases. And that's certainly something that's happening continuously and continuing, and the germplasm pool has the diversity to address the challenges which we need. But there are new methods which many research labs, including my own, are using to make better and sustainable use of the gene pool. So that's improving the yield, the quality, and the sustainability using the inputs of the agronomy and the genetics and the technology. And this logo on the right is from the International Biodiversity Day earlier this summer. So we are getting better at the ways that we're doing this, but we need to think about what we need to do and how we can improve that sustainability, how we can improve the crops that we're using. And a couple of examples I want to give of that is here's two different wheat crops being harvested. The one here at the top left, you can see the crop is standing and the combine is just starting the harvest in that. The one on the right, the crop has fallen over, and this is because of a disease called Pseudocercospirilla, and that forms a rot at the base of the stem, and then if there's wind or rain shortly before harvest, the crop will fall over. And you can see in the left-hand wheat plant there's resistance, and that resistance comes from introgression from a wild wheat species, and that wild wheat species stops the plant rotting and falling over. It's completely resistant to it. That's a fungus disease. Next example is resistance to a viral disease, wheat streak mosaic virus. And you can see here the control lines, varieties like the wheat variety Tomahawk here is very yellow with the virus, whereas these selections like the variety Mace here, NO2 Y5106, that is resistant to this virus. And once more, that's introgression of a character from a wild wheat species called Thinopyron bessarabicum. And you can see the wild wheat chromosome coloured in red at 12 o'clock and at 5 o'clock in this picture. That red Thinopyron chromosome is carrying the resistance to the wheat streak mosaic virus. Another example of more modern technology that's preserving soil and reducing energy input is zero-till agriculture, and here we can see an example in South America, in Brazil, where herbicide-tolerant maize is being directly drilled into a weedy field, and in that case, because the soil isn't disturbed very much by the planting, the weeds are sprayed off with the herbicide after the crop is established. There's much lower erosion, and yet the yield is still extremely high from the crop, and it establishes in a seedbed which includes other plants which maintain the soil nutrients, stop erosion, maintain the soil organic matter. So solutions then for sustainable agriculture, including better technology, better use of what's used, what's present, reduction of the crop losses, crop protection improvements, and making sure the plants have all of the nitrogen, phosphates, potassium, and micronutrients that are needed. Other ways are better control of the environment, potentially using cover and irrigation, but better use of the water. And then, of course, what we've been talking about, particularly the better genetics to give resistances to abiotic, environmental, and biotic stresses, improving the yield and making that uniform from year to year. All of this genetic work then feeds specifically into the global goals, the sustainable development goals of the United Nations. And during the 2 tutorials, we will be considering the impacts of agriculture on each one of these. During the first tutorial, we will talk about zero hunger as the major impact of agricultural genetics on sustainability, but then you will be on the Sustainable Development Goals. But then in the second tutorial, you'll be asked to choose to prepare one or two of these different aspects to think about how agriculture and land use are affecting each one of those. So in conclusion then, I hope I've talked about some of the global challenges in the context of the biosphere and how many of the solutions come from genetics, agriculture, animal and plant breeding, and how we can reduce the threats to biodiversity and improve the sustainability. Of course, a very important aspect is the Sustainable Development Goal number 617, which is producing a partnership, and it's also quality education, not only at the level of the primary education and secondary education that's thought about there, but also at the tertiary education of people who can go out and show how management can be improved. Thank you.